everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Research Done Right. Today's lesson, Lesson 6, is going to be about observational research methods. In Lesson 5, we talked about a variety of different measurement concepts as well as scales we could use to measure our variables. We also talked about the importance of using reliable measurement tools when it comes to collecting our data. Now we're ready to discuss a variety of different types of research methods that you can use when conducting your own research. So on the agenda, we have quantitative versus qualitative methods. So quantitative refers to collecting some type of numeric data, and qualitative methods refers to collecting stories, verbal feedback, things like that. Then we're going to talk about naturalistic observation and how that differs from systematic observation. So even though we're observing a particular sample or population, both of these methods, they do differ in some ways. We'll talk about case studies, so basically how we can conduct research on a particular person or group of people, and we'll wrap up our discussion by talking about archival research. So let's get started. When we talk about quantitative versus qualitative methods, let's focus on quantitative first. The quantitative research approach focuses on behaviors that we can actually count, so we can assign a number to something that we are observing. Typically, quantitative research involves larger samples, and the conclusions we make from this data are based on statistical analyses that we conduct. Now, if you remember back to your statistics class, there is the concept of statistical power, and statistical power comes from a larger N, a larger sample size. So typically when we say we want to conduct research at scale, that means that we want to have a larger sample size so that the data that we do collect will be applicable for statistical analyses where we can find statistical significance between our variables. For example, using a survey to assess a participant's satisfaction with the particular school course would involve a rating scale in which the participants would have to provide an answer from 1 to 5. For example, 1 could be least satisfied and 5 could be most satisfied. So after the participants indicate their level of satisfaction, we then can input these numbers into a statistical software and then look for significant differences between these numbers. Qualitative research, on the other hand, focuses on people behaving in natural settings, and it generally includes smaller samples given the fact that you are in a limited setting. The other difference between quantitative and qualitative is that the qualitative research approach is interested in collecting in-depth information on a smaller group of participants. So you can think of things like interviews or discussions. Even something like a focus group would count as a qualitative research methodology. And in qualitative research, the conclusions are based on the interpretations drawn by the researchers. So again, if you think back to the previous example I gave you when we would be observing children in a playground and trying to analyze their aggressive behaviors, that was based on the researcher's perception of his or her observations of these kids on the playground. So yes, operationally defining your variables definitely helps. However, there is still a limitation to qualitative research because the interpretations are subjective and based on the researcher's perception. For an analogy, using the same example we had about rating a course, a qualitative approach to this would be having a discussion with, let's say, 8 people from a course and asking them to explain why they like it or dislike it. So this is different from the survey in which the participants would just rate how much they like or dislike the course. And typically they're not able to provide any sort of follow-up information to justify their reasoning. So qualitative research does allow us to get to the why behind the participants' behaviors or choices or reactions. But the quantitative approach allows us to collect more data from more people. So when thinking about the type of methodology you want to use, it's important to think about if you are interested in using quantitative or qualitative research methods. But the good news is you don't necessarily only need to pick one. In fact, oftentimes qualitative and quantitative research are conducted together for a similar research project. So now let's talk a little bit about a more qualitative research approach, the first one being naturalistic observation. So naturalistic observation is also called field work or field observation. And in this method, basically the researcher is making observations of individuals in their natural environment. Now, naturalistic observation is typically used for social psychology or organizational psychology, any time in which you need to observe how people interact with others at any given time. For example, watching the interaction of males and females in a bar, or perhaps tracking how employees interact with each other daily on the job. Ultimately, the researcher does not attempt to influence what behaviors occur. So this is very different than a laboratory setting in which a researcher has a specific hypothesis that he or she wants to test. So in naturalistic observation, researchers often don't have a formulated hypothesis. They're there just to observe. And then through these observations, they develop a particular hypothesis, which then they could follow up with another study. So when you're doing naturalistic observation, having a good system to keep track of your observations is critical. So you want to make sure that you have a detailed way to collect your data and to make sure that you keep those records updated and in a way that you can access them. Naturalistic observation also includes interviewing the informants, examining documents about the particular setting, and ultimately using audio or video recordings. So imagine that you are a researcher and you are interested, let's go back to our bar example. You're interested in observing the behavior, interactions of males and females in a particular bar. So yes, you go bar hopping, but you can imagine that it could be difficult to observe and record your data at the same time. So sometimes we think that, okay, I'll observe it and then later I'll write it down. But the bad news is that we tend to forget a lot of information, even though we think that our memories are perfect. So doing something like that with another fellow researcher is also highly recommended. So you have one person kind of taking notes and making records, while the other person is more in the field. In certain times, depending on whether the participants know that you're observing them or whether they don't, and we'll get to that in a minute, but using some type of recording device is very helpful. So perhaps using an audio recorder and talking into something will make things faster and would decrease the amount of equipment you need to carry around with you than if you were to carry around a laptop and type your notes immediately after you've made the observation. So now let's talk about participation and concealment. When doing a field study, it is up to the researcher to decide to be an active participating member of this environment or to conceal his or her identity. So hopefully you're thinking to yourself, well, what are the pros and cons of each of these? So let's start with participant observation. If you are an active member of a particular environment or group or setting, it allows you as the researcher to observe the setting from the inside as opposed to a third person view, from the outside looking in. This does bring you closer to your participants and perhaps will allow you to experience things firsthand. But in these instances, the other people within this population or group or whatever it is, that social setting that you're observing, they don't necessarily need to know your goals for being there. So the good part about this, right, the pros are that you can acquire valuable information from primary sources because you're there to see it and experience it. But on the other hand, there is a danger of losing your objectivity to the project, right? You may start to build friendships, make relationships with the people in this particular setting. And so that's something to be very careful of. The other situation is that we want to avoid reactivity, right? So if participants know that you're there to complete particular research or evaluate them on variable X, this may cause them to react to your presence. And in turn, we know that reactivity causes unnatural behavior in participants in their natural environment. So it's ultimately up to you as the researcher to determine if you want to be an active participant observer or if you choose to observe from the side. Now, the second factor, concealment, is basically to hide, right? So in concealment, a researcher is hiding his or her true identity, but of course, in the most ethical way possible. So this allows you to decrease the invasion of privacy issue, and it also allows you to remain more objective. Some limitations of this field research is the fact that the conditions are really unpredictable. So for example, if you are going out into a particular social setting and you want to observe particular behaviors, it's really hard to predict what types of events will unfold because you don't have this experimental control. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the movie Never Been Kissed with Drew Barrymore, but in that movie, Drew Barrymore plays a journalist in which she is interested in writing an article for a newspaper about high school and prom and things like that. And ultimately, she expresses the fact that she has actually never been kissed by a boy. And so she disguises herself as a member of this high school. She doesn't tell anybody. She develops this romantic situation with one of the teachers. Naturally, the teacher realizes that having any sort of relationships with students is unethical, but she conceals her identity from him. Later, towards the end of the movie, when we discover that she, in fact, is not a real student, and she's so excited to tell the teacher, well, the one that she likes, to tell him that it's okay, they could be together because she's actually not a student, he gets really, really upset with her. So again, yes, that's a movie setting, but that's a great example of, really thinking and outweighing the pros and the cons when it comes to determining if you want to conceal your identity or if you don't. Now, regardless of concealment or not, we do have a variety of different limitations when it comes to field research. One of them being that the conditions during your observation are really unpredictable because we don't have any sort of experimental control. We're sort of going out into the wild to see what's going to happen in a particular social setting. And given the way that events tend to unfold, especially if you're spending a significant amount of time in the field observing a particular group of people, your hypotheses may constantly change based on what you're seeing. Now, we know it's absolutely true that because things tend to change and evolve over time, naturally our behaviors will change as well. So kind of as a researcher, you have to determine where is the cutoff point, how much time are you actually going to spend in this setting, and how much time do you need to actually get significant data that will help you with your particular research question. The other issue with field research or naturalistic observation is that our external validity, if you remember what that means, is pretty low. So it's really hard to generalize results that we come up with beyond the group or the social setting that we've observed. So if I went to go do my naturalistic observation in bars in the Los Angeles County area, given very specific regions, that wouldn't allow me to generalize to bars all over the United States. The results can be generalized only to the types of participants, or the types of social setting that you've observed. So again, internal validity is kind of low because of the lack of experimental control, and the external validity also because it's really hard to generalize beyond a particular group of people that you're observing. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing because perhaps as a researcher, your interest is only focused on bars in the Los Angeles County. And maybe you're interested only in a particular ethnic group or only in a particular age group. And that's totally fine. So again, just because generalization or external validity is lower, it doesn't mean that your study is not valid. That's totally not what it means. It all depends on what your research question is and what it is that you're hoping to answer. Naturalistic observation was the first type of observational method. Now let's talk about systematic observations and see how this differs from naturalistic observation. So systematic observation refers to the careful observation of very few specific behaviors. And we typically start systematically observing something after we've already developed some particular hypothesis. So in contrary to the naturalistic observation, with naturalistic observation, we go out into the field and we just observe. Based on what we see, we develop a hypothesis. For systematic observation, it's quite the opposite. We have a hunch, we have a particular hypothesis or prediction for how certain behaviors will occur. And then we go and we start observing and we count those specific behaviors. So we know exactly what we're looking for, and we're able to count and quantify those particular behaviors. So systematic observations are often applied in a laboratory setting. For example, if you were to have the opportunity to install video cameras in a particular marriage and family therapist's office, right? And let's say when nobody is there, you can observe the interaction between the husband and wife. And based on the things that they say to each other, for example, they could support each other and react positively by agreeing with their partner, or they can express, some sort of aggression or negativity towards each other, where they yell at each other, they refuse to take each other's points of view, etc. So basically, we have this categorical or nominal data, right? Like supports the partner or does not support the partner. And what we do is we code it. We assign a number to each particular behavior or observation. So similarly to the naturalistic observation, right, there is the question of equipment. So using audio or video recorders to capture behaviors is highly encouraged, because we know that our memory can change, but a video will not. Again, there is the consequence of reactivity, right? So if the couple knew that an observer was present and was watching them, then perhaps they would have behaved differently in a non-natural way and possibly in a more socially desirable way. And then again, the concept of reliability. So if you remember when we talked about measurement concepts and reliability in the last lecture, we talked about what is called inter-rater reliability. So inter-rater reliability is related to the fact that you have at least two, generally preferably three researchers that are observing the behaviors with you and coding the behaviors in the same way that you are, in order to ensure that your perceptions of what it is that you're seeing or hearing are in fact valid. And so you have other raters that can back you up and agree with you. And if you guys disagree, then you don't have inter-rater reliability. And then there are certain steps that you take in order to iron those things out. So the last methodological issue when it comes to systematic observations is that of sampling, right? We know that we don't want this third variable or confounding variable problem. And so in order to mitigate that, what we do is we try to practice as much experimental control as possible. But if we take samples of behavior over time, this may lead to confounds if those variables cannot be controlled by us as the researchers. So just to recap, we talked about naturalistic observation and systematic observation. Naturalistic observation refers to when researchers go out into the field or do field work in order to just observe and get a better understanding at a general level of a particular social group or social setting. Based on those observations, they then can generate hypotheses. Systematic observations is when a researcher has already a particular hypothesis that he or she wants to test, but again, they want to test it in some type of natural setting. So they will observe specific behaviors that have been operationally defined, and they will try to quantify them. So both types of observational methods are absolutely appropriate within the realms of ethics, reliability, and validity. So now let's talk about another type of methodology called a case study. A case study is an observational method that provides a description of an individual or a small group. So this could be a person, a business, a school, a neighborhood, an organization. And case studies are typically conducted for rare, unusual, or noteworthy conditions. So for example, I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with the case of Clive Wearing. Clive Wearing had a particular infection in his brain that had caused him to forget and lose essentially his memories of everything before his trauma, before the infection, but he still was able to remember how to play the piano perfectly. He remembered who his wife was, etc. So he was a special case that suffered from retrograde and anterograde amnesia. He only had a certain portion of his memories from before the trauma, and he was unable to make new memories. So he was a very special case, and he basically was studied a lot by a lot of researchers. So he has his own case study. There's also a case study around Jeannie, who is the 13-year-old girl who had been strapped to a chair and not spoken to until she was discovered at age 13. So a lot of linguists and language researchers did a lot of studies with her, basically to develop her language and her speaking skills. And so the researchers discovered that while she was able to put together simple sentences, she never reached her full maximum potential to learn language properties. So again, in the case of Jeannie, she was kind of a one-off case. We hadn't seen anything like that before. And so she, of course, is known for a particular case study all to herself. So case studies often overlap with naturalistic observations, but they don't necessarily need to involve it. And a specific type of case study is called a psychobiography. So a psychobiography is the type of case study in which a researcher applies psychological theory to explain the life of a particular individual. So, for example, let's say a particular serial killer was captured and placed in jail, and we really want to understand kind of what's going on in the brain of someone who would be committing crime after crime after crime, and especially when it comes to murder. So they tried to analyze the person's life based on various psychological theories that we already know. So a psychobiography would definitely involve a variety of research, including library research, right? Looking up references related to this type of behavior. Also, that would lead to literature reviews, and then perhaps based on information or theories that you gather from literature reviews, then you can conduct interviews with people who knew this person. So basically, it's kind of like a snowball effect, but you're trying to gather all of the resources that you can to paint a picture, about this particular person, or as we mentioned, business, school, group of people, etc. And case studies lead to the development of really insightful hypotheses, which later in the future can be systematically tested or researched. So in other words, when we see very special cases in psychology, whether it's on a neurological level, right? Different parts of the brain are severed and we can see how that affects behavior, or whether it's something like related to crime or someone's inability, to develop a certain skill. So things like that are so rare that they become case studies, but it's not like we just research them and then forget about them. No, on the contrary, they are the fuel for future research, to understand what we can do in the future so that we can learn from this better. So that brings us to our last topic, archival research. So when you think of an archive, you think of something old, something like in storage. And so archival research is just that. It's using previously compiled information to answer a specific research question that you have. So you, as the researcher, do not collect the original data. But for example, if you wanted to see the differences in crime rate between 1990 and 2000, because you were not able to collect all of that research yourself, you would basically do archival research, and you would dig in to see into a variety of public documents, to see the difference in crime rates. Or perhaps you were interested in researching how different types of weather affected crime rate. So what you would do is you would go again into the archives, conduct archival research, and look up crime rates that took place in various seasons across a variety of different years. Then you would correlate that data to see if there are in fact relationships between crime rates and weather, or if there are not. So again, even though you are not the person collecting the research, you can still conduct archival research to find new relationships from information from the past. And ultimately, you would be analyzing or coding existing data based on statistics and public records. So the downside to this is that some of these places or people who would provide this information no longer exist. And because we can't really ask someone to validate if it was true or not, we still have to remain kind of skeptical. Does it mean you shouldn't do this research? No. But again, it just means that in the limitation section of your paper, you would explain that your methodology of archival research does have some limitations of its own. And so there are 3 different types of archival research. The first one involves the use of statistical records, for example, the Census Bureau data, educational testing services, or even sports. The second are survey archives. So data from surveys that are stored on computers and available to us as researchers who wish to analyze them. So most researchers don't have the funds or resources to gather extensive amounts of data, but with survey archives, they can still conduct this research because they do have access to it from previous years. And the third type of archival research is written and mass communication records. So this involves newspapers, TV shows, diaries, letters, books, movies. Any of these types of things are considered archival research, especially those that are preserved by historical societies. So whether you go to a museum, or perhaps there are certain journals that have manuscripts that are funded by historical societies, you can also use those to conduct your archival research. So there is this concept of content analysis in which you look through these different references in a systematic way, but in addition to just reading them, you're coding and you're quantifying how many times you see certain types of information. So you could actually add a quantitative component to something like archival research if you are reading a variety of different manuscripts and information and data that are written in it. Okay, so just to recap, in this lecture, we talked about observational research methods. We learned about naturalistic observation and how it differs from systematic observation. We talked about case studies, and we talked about archival research. So all of these are different methods that you can use to conduct your own research. And remember, it's totally okay to combine methodology if you want to pick more than one. The more knowledge you have about more methods, the more interesting and more creative and unique you can be when you craft your own research experiment. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time on Research Done Right.